Mega Man had a rough transition to the 2010s and beyond. Before that, he was nearly ubiquitous. Dozens of games in the first 20-odd years, spanning multiple different mainline series, spanning different genres, most having their own spin-offs, and on and on. The Mega Man X series debuted on the Super Nintendo and shifted the focus of the series. While classic Mega Man leans more into platforming, with a good helping of action, X is action first and platforming second, focusing on more complex enemies and bosses, while also adding in various systems to complement this. Mega Man X3 has an interesting history, coming out almost exactly a year after X2. To call it a bit of a rush job is an understatement. To this end, a lot of the actual dev work was offloaded to Minakuchi Engineering, the studio that made Mega Man's lackluster Gameboy games, and in my opinion it kinda shows. X3 is a bit of a swan song for the Super Nintendo era as it transitioned the series into the PS1. As such, it was initially available on the Super Nintendo, but 6 months later was ported to the PlayStation and Saturn, although the Saturn version apparently runs very poorly. Both of these versions are also only available in Europe and Japan for some reason. Even later, the game was also directly ported to Windows. While gameplay and graphics are the same, the PlayStation 1 version has enhanced music and instrumentation. Here's a quick comparison. Plus the addition of full motion videos. Capcom can't seem to decide which version they'd like to keep around. The Gamecube and PS2 Mega Man X collection comes with the PS1 version, but since, presumably due to easier emulation and the fact that the PlayStation 1 version was never released outside of Europe and Japan, the Super Nintendo version has seen a Wii U Virtual Console release, and was included on the newer Mega Man X Legacy collection, which is on PS4, Xbox One, and Switch. It would have been nice to see both versions released on that collection, as it has PS1 emulation with X4 and beyond, but what can you do, I suppose. For this video, I played the Super Nintendo version on the Legacy collection and the PS1 version on the X collection. The X series is a bit more focused on story than classic, so I'll do a quick catch up to get us into the state of this game. The X series takes place about 100 years after Mega Man. Dr. Light, Mega Man's creator, builds X sometime after the classic series to defend humanity, but when X wakes up, he finds a world where a Maverick named Sigma has been constantly causing terror after being infected by the Maverick virus by Dr. Wily, Mega Man's rival's final creation Zero, who loses the virus himself and becomes a close ally to X. In X2, Sigma is seemingly killed, leading to X3 having a new villain, Dr. Doppler, who has started creating his own Mavericks. There isn't much else to it at this point. The story is very backloaded into the final couple stages. Mega Man X3 maintains the standard gameplay of the X series. Mega Man runs, jumps, and shoots with a few twists on the classic series. Primarily, Mega Man can charge his boss through 3 stages, gaining power and piercing enemies the stronger it is, wall jumping, which lets him scale walls obviously, and dashing, which gives him a short burst of speed, during which he can jump further and higher, and even wall jump faster and further. While a lot of these options could make for interesting platform, and occasionally does, the game would rather focus on fast-paced action, especially in bosses. That's not to say levels are entirely neglected. Arguably the stages in X3 are too long. They feel like they drag on forever, especially a few like Tunnel Rhino's stage. 3 full platforming segments and 2 mini-boss rooms, one usually empty, I'll come back to that, but with a checkpoint only after the first. Lose any time between the empty room and Tunnel Rhino and face the mini-boss over and over. It's not always a problem. Stages like Blizzard Buffalo are similar in length to earlier and later X games, it's just some of them. Speaking on combat stuff, X has the ability, like his forebearer, to steal weapons from the bosses he defeated, 8 in total, although each is semi-limited in usefulness by individual weapon energy preventing overuse, although enemies frequently drop more to refill them. On top of firing in different ways, some are lobs, some have delayed firing, or even weirder stuff, every boss and enemy in the game also has a specific weakness, which helps a lot because the bosses can be a bitch in X3, they hit hard and act aggressive, even more so than the other X games to a frustrating degree sometimes, although some of the weapons trivialize the bosses they're good against to a frightening degree. The weapons unlocked from bosses also serve another purpose, opening secret areas and stages, unfortunately nothing that actually aids in movement. But weapons like the Tornado Fang can break cracked walls to find secret areas, which often hold upgrades like a Metroidvania. Upgrades are spread throughout the stages, although the stages are linear, making backtracking a touch more painful. The upgrades aren't very well planned out either, quite a few require backtracking outright, not just for items and upgrades from later stages in your probable order, but one just flat out requiring you to beat a boss that is weak to the weapon from the stage the upgrade is in. Upgrades are a solid benefit, and while they don't make the game a cakewalk, they can certainly make it more manageable. Each stage has a heart container, a very small boost Ax's health bar that culminates in doubling it with all of them. The other upgrades have much more specific utilities. The 4 sub-tanks can be filled with health drops to restore health at any time, effectively further quadrupling X's maximum health. Ride armors are mecha units that X can hop into at certain points. Each of the 4 has slightly different attacks and properties, but outside of being really powerful and having a few upgrades locked behind them, their location-based activation makes them very limited in usefulness. And finally, there are the parts, unique upgrades to X, as well as the enhancement chips which further upgrade those parts, although only one can be selected ever, so it's a tough choice on top of locking the player out of the ultimate armor, which gives the player all 4 chips, but isn't available until the start of Doppler's lab right at the end of the game. The armor upgrade reduces the amount of damage X takes, and after taking a hit briefly gives him a shield to further reduce damage, while the super armor chip doubles the power of both these effects, which is obviously great for survivability. The boot part gives Mega Man an air dash, left, right, or straight up, although going up has a slight delay before boosting, making it risky as a dodge, an incredible tool that makes platforming, dodging attacks in battle far more reasonable. That said, some stages require or borderline require it, like Toxic Seahorse. Very precise jumps might be possible, and that's before getting into how much harder many of the bosses like Byte would be without it. It's a bit of Chill Penguin creeping back into the series, where the dash itself was in Chill Penguin stage in Mega Man X1, borderline requiring going there first, although at least there it wasn't missable. The boots are hidden away in Blizzard Buffalo's stage behind an extremely precise jump, and they're very easy to miss, which requires both knowing where it is and going to that stage first because of how important it is. I imagine a lot of kids got stuck not knowing where it was or not being able to reach it and being walled because of it. The Super Boots chip lets X air dash a second time, which is neat. The helmet part is a radar. With it, the map screen lists upgrades available in each stage and if they've been obtained. Upon entering a stage, a map is also displayed showing where they are, although the map can't be brought back up, which makes it a little less than useful. The super helmet chip goes into left field as something completely different and completely broken. By standing still, X will slowly recover health and fill his sub-tanks. If not going for the hyper armor, which you should, this is the chip to take. It breaks the game through the final bosses and makes the final bosses way more reasonable, because without it, after every loss, it's time for 20 minutes of item farming. Finally, the arm part, which gives X 2 extra levels of charge. Level 4 shoots a twisting projectile that explodes diagonally out on contact, while also holding a level 2 charge that can be fired off after, while level 5 stores a level 3 charge after, and if both are fired off, they combine into an even stronger projectile with a total of 4 diagonal projectiles that shreds pretty much any enemy in the game. On top of that, it allows X to charge the boss weapons, which each have a unique move for being charged that has different use cases for better or worse than their default attacks. The arm chip gives X a new weapon, the Hypercharge, which gives him permanently charged shots at max energy, although unlike the Buster itself, it has weapon energy that can only be refilled by taking hits. It's really good for the final bosses, but runs out of energy too fast to be usable in normal stages. Having all 4 of the basic parts also has a bonus effect of reducing energy consumption of weapons by half, which is just a nice little extra benefit. Finally, there's Zero. I don't know where to put him at all. At any time in a stage, X can switch to Zero, who's generally stronger, given he has 4 levels of charge by default, the 4th being his short-range Z-Saber Slash that decimates pretty much anything in the game, and his health starts at maximum, about twice X's, but he also has a lot of drawbacks. He can only use his default weapons, no boss weapons or anything like that, can't obtain or use upgrades, including sub-tanks, can only be called once per stage, and can't fight bosses with 2 exceptions, automatically switching back to X if attempted. And of course, if he dies, he can't be called for the rest of the game, and the player gets the bad ending, which is extremely fucking harsh no matter how you cut it. To that end, he's hardly worth using due to the risks, save in the very early game to get X upgrades assuming you're confident not accidentally touching a single spike and losing him. It's nice that he's playable for the first time, but the implementation is questionable, and later games just give him his own version of the game to play through. He hardly warrants using here outside of a few specific examples. So that's a lot, but it should give you some idea of what the game is like, and that's a good way to say the game is fun but has a lot of weird choices that harm it. The core gameplay of Mega Man X3 is good on paper, a bunch of fun tools and very fast paced, although the minor input lag on the Legacy collection is a bummer. It's the same stuff that made the X series so great in the first place, but everything around it is so weird. Levels that drag on too long, a semi-forced level order based around hidden upgrades, bosses going from very difficult to the point I'd say most would be impossible as first picks for an average player before they have weapons, to being cakewalks with their weapons, and Zero being a weird afterthought just shoved into the game kinda arbitrarily that it kinda drags the game down in general a lot, despite having the grounds of being great. Visually, it's a Super Nintendo game, a very good looking one at that. Each stage has distinct visual theming and effects, plus plenty of animation in the background, and despite the stages wearing on me, they tend to have a good variety too. Blizzard Buffalo's stage begins in a clear outdoor area, then has some indoor segments in an icy cave, then goes back outside with a snow overlay. And all the stages have fun changes of scenery like this that help keep things fresh for the most part. I also love some of the weirder stage stuff. Neon Tiger's jungle is really neat, with the busy jungle background mixed with modern buildings in between. The real star of the show though is the character sprites, especially the Mavericks. Mavericks all take inspiration from various animals, and not only have great designs on their own, but have really wonderful and surprisingly large and detailed sprites with plenty of animation. Obviously the graphics are a little less impressive on the PS1, especially compared to the games that came after, which really sharpen the look for those higher powered consoles, but it does have the FMVs. The full motion videos are well animated, although they are silent, only accompanied by music. They obviously suffer from the PS1's limited disc space, very compressed and crusty, and there aren't that many. An intro one, very brief ones before each stage to introduce the Mavericks, which I really love as a feature, it helps give them a little more personality, and one at the end. The Maverick ones have some typos, which is probably a hilarious side effect of them being animated in Asia. The one for the credits is a bit baffling, being an FMV for the game's credits from the Super Nintendo version for seemingly no reason except to insert, very awkwardly might I add, a picture-in-picture reel of random clips from the animated sequences in black and white. It's a weird fucking choice. Musically, the game is a bit off, but I do like it. A lot of the stage music is chiller than you'd expect, like my favorite, Blizzard Buffalo's, but it does have that high-energy rocky guitar in there. Also weird, Neon Tiger's stage basically plagiarized My Michelle by Guns N' Roses, which is just a funny thing. The PS1 music goes for a bit of a different style. Tracks are much less rocky and use their instrumentation for an even chiller vibe. The music that was good is made better, even if it is a bit of a different atmosphere. The soundtrack alone is a good reason to pick the PS1 version over the Super Nintendo original, and it's overall hard to complain about anything in the aesthetics department here. It's a well-animated, colorful, and varied game graphically, with a decent soundtrack to boot. Mega Man X3 begins solidly enough at the Maverick Hunter headquarters, which is under attack and serves as a nice tutorial. It sets up stakes that Doppler's forces are strong enough to pull off a direct attack on Mega Man's base, all the while wordlessly forcing the player to learn the controls and basic mechanics of the game like the wall jump. It even has the only segment in the game where Zero must be played as, showing off his differences and even giving him his own exclusive boss battle against the traitor Mac, who is simple as a tutorial boss can be, but it does help highlight Zero's high durability and strength and other differences for the player. The stage also ends, as these games tend to do, with a giant boss that floats in the background and attacks towards the front of the screen. It's a flashy spectacle, but extremely easy. Generously, you could say it teaches about jumping and shooting, as only its head is vulnerable, but I'm not sure if that was the intention. After this opener, the game opens up. X can technically choose any stage from here and start going in on bosses. After picking one, it's best to move to the one that is weak to the previously attained weapon, which go in a complete circle that looks like this. Blizzard Buffalo is the obvious starting point. He's the easiest, or close to the easiest boss in the game, and of course he has the leg part, as I complained about before, which is easily the most valuable upgrade at this point in the game, which also happens to give access to a sub-tank in the same stage. The stage itself is basically perfect as an intro stage too. The slippery ice is a relatively minor change to the formula that was established in the first stage, and the stage is the perfect length, short and sweet with relatively little bullshit. It also has a moderate showcase of stage changes caused by beating certain bosses. Unlike some games which make these changes pretty extreme and completely change the stages, they're very minor here. Volt Catfish's defeat causes the lights in the stage to glow, which reduces the amount of ice in a few places to make the stage easier. Blizzard Buffalo falls into an archetype of Mega Man bosses that could be called a charger or something like that. He spends most of his time charging back and forth between walls. When he rams them, he knocks X off, so jumping over him to get behind him and deal some damage is key. The boot parts obviously really help with getting above and around him. He also occasionally mixes in shooting blobs of ice, which stick to the floor and walls to make dodging a bit harder, and when at low health, his desperation move is a beam that can be wall jumped over. He's a very good learning opportunity for wall jumps, and relatively easy without his weakness, although he does hit incredibly hard, like 2 or 3 hits from him is enough to kill you from full health hard. His weakness is the parasitic bomb, which doesn't have very interesting interactions with him, just deals more damage, which also makes him a good candidate for the first boss. Blizzard Buffalo's weapon is the Frost Shield, which isn't remotely a shield, but what can you do? Also, that's not a mistranslation, it's also called the Frost Shield in Japan, so. When fired, it forms a spear that after a brief delay launches forward. If it hits an enemy, it'll also leave an ice spike on the ground that can deal further damage. It also gets larger and leaves a larger spike when underwater, but the amount of times the game has underwater sections can be counted on one hand. It's one of the less useful abilities simply because it's so slow. Its charge form is baffling, but I guess it is actually a shield, attaching a spike to Mega Man's Buster that damages enemies if Mega Man gets way too close for comfort to them, but also reflecting minor projectiles, and when it wears off, it shoots a projectile that slides along the ground, which isn't that useful either. When used underwater though, it instead forms a platform that floats upward, which is useful exactly once to get the kangaroo ride armor. I really never found a good time to use the Frost Shield outside of using it on bosses that are weak to it. There are a lot of other weapons that are more utility outside of the very specific boss that they're weak to. Toxic Seahorse's stage is highly vertical. If it's possible without the air dash, it's incredibly difficult and precise, which is a great reason not to start here. I do like the section at the start, it's light on gimmicks and enemies, and almost purely platforming, which X3 doesn't have a lot of, and it leads into one of the game's few underwater sections. In itself it isn't very interesting, but with the frog robot armor, the only one capable of moving underwater, there's a neat section to get a different ride armor, either by jumping at the top of the water, which is literally never done elsewhere, or by chasing it with the powered up ice shield to make a platform, which is not available yet, which is a nice two-pronged approach to making a solution. The underwater also has a mid-boss who's extremely passive and easy to the point of hardly bearing mentioning. Toxic Seahorse himself is easy-ish but a bit tricky. He spends most of his time either jumping around or throwing out acid balls, which can be destroyed with enough shots. His movement can be a bit random and his projectile requires some fast reactions, but he's certainly doable without his weakness. Unfortunately for him, his weakness is pretty crippling, as after every hit he'll always jump, and while his acid balls can block the ice shield shots, with proper timing he can simply be looped to keep him from ever acting again. His weapon Acid Burst is fairly useful. It's lobbed in an arc, which lets it be fired over ledges or at overhead enemies, and on contact with an enemy or the floor, drops small drops of acid that linger briefly to catch moving enemies. Its charge variant shoots 2 acid balls that bounce along the ground, improving range, while still allowing them to hit things below X. All in all, pretty versatile and useful. Following the second stage, a short cutscene plays with Doppler sending out 2 Mavericks while a third lurks in the shadows. I'll hold off on the latter 2, but the first is Bits, who from here on out has a chance of appearing in the first mid-boss room of every stage, something I was unlucky enough to get while trying the third stage. Bit, in my opinion, is the hardest boss in the game, even worse than the final bosses, made worse by Tunnel Rhino's stage having very few enemies to get health off of, and being very long. The fact that Bit can randomly come and wall you for ages is cruel beyond belief, although it's another element of why I did Blizzard Buffalo first, as he's weak to the ice shield. Bit does 3 things. Jump, then charge across the screen. He'll dash at X's height when he's at the peak of his jump, so he can be baited into jumping high, a good time to hit him. But as he shields his upper body, the ice shield shots need to be carefully aimed at his legs. Keep in mind, weapon energy doesn't restore on death, so if you fuck up too much, you'll need to game over or farm to get another good shot at him. On top of this, he'll toss out rings that hold X's movements, allowing him to line up easy dashes. At first he'll only throw out 1 ring, but at low health he'll start throwing out 2 at a time, or homing fireballs, again 1 at first, 2 later, up to 5 projectiles that require jumping to dodge while trying to time jumps to avoid being dashed into. The screen quickly devolves into a chaotic mess. It's a horrible fight, and so cruel to randomly drop on someone this early when they'll likely be low on upgrades and skill. Each game over increases the chance that he'll show up on Tunnel Rhino's stage, but game overing after doesn't make him go away after he shows up. It's a horrible nightmare fight that tries to snap the boss order and made the early game extremely painful for me. Made even funnier because Bit's counterpart is far easier but doesn't show up until after the 5th stage. It's also worth noting that killing Bit with his weakness removes him from the game entirely. If this isn't done to him and his counterpart, they'll reappear much later. Tunnel Rhino's stage itself is my least favorite by far too, long segments made up almost entirely of walls of enemies, with the only interesting platforming being to dodge rolling boulders, most of which are sprung on you from off screen to surprise you. The only checkpoint follows Bit's room, which means the mid-boss needs to be fought after every death before Tunnel Rhino. Hell Crusher is usually easy, just slowly charging Mega Man, but occasionally can split himself in half to drop an incredibly difficult to dodge attack. But even being easy, it's a pace killer to fight him over and over again while learning a long and tough stage. It's also worth noting that 2 of this stage's items are locked behind a charged version of a later boss's power, and Tunnel Rhino's weapon is required to get the arm grade, more than a little frustrating to force this much backtracking. Tunnel Rhino is probably the hardest of the Mavericks too, as well as incredibly lame. He's effectively a harder version of Blizzard Buffalo. He charges back and forth while occasionally shooting drills. The hard part comes in that getting hit once usually means getting hit a few times while he stands on top of you for heavy damage. Plus his penchant for becoming invincible during charges at low health, meaning he can just cruise past acid bursts that would normally stun him to dole out more damage. He's not unstoppable, but a bit lazy because he's just a more annoying version of a boss that's already been fought with no interesting changes. Even his weapon is roughly a clone of the Frost Shield. Tornado Fang is a drill that comes out, hangs in the air for a second, then launches forward, only differentiated by trading the Lingering Ice Spike ability for the ability to fire multiple drills that form a spread pattern. A little better in general, but still not that great for general usage, although it can be used to break crack walls necessary to get the arm part. When charged, it forms a drill that hangs from X's buster as long as the button is held, which requires getting in close, which is not an incredible prospect. It's also worth noting that a lot of bosses just don't take damage from this weapon at all, period, which limits its usefulness further. Catfish's stage is a better version of Tunnel Rhino's. It's a long, straightforward stage swarmed with enemies, although ones that are far more interesting than Rhino's, like robots that attempt to dodge attacks then shoot along the ground, good targets for something like Acid Burst, which hits low. There's also a few segments of elevators where X needs to quickly dodge around attacks from enemies on the sides, which is a fun gimmick, plus the elevators raise into spikes, forcing some quick thinking. but reasonably so, which I like. He jumps around a lot and fires off electricity mines that travel along the walls and floors, keeping the player on their toes. I love the interaction the Tornado Fang has with his low health desperation move, where he forms a barrier around himself and tosses sparks around. The barrier deflects most attacks, but the drill is capable of burrowing through it to hit him, although unfortunately it makes him very exploitable as he'll continue trying to use the attack every time it drills through, leaving him as a sitting duck. Full Catfish's weapon is easily my favorite in the game. Triad Thunder forms an electric barrier around X that he can rotate by pressing the button again. An enemy that runs into these will take damage, letting him use it to ward off approach and move around easier, and if it does happen to run its course well out, it blasts lightning bolts out from itself for a long-range attack in various directions, which is extremely versatile. Plus its charge attack is great in concept and execution. X punches the ground causing an earthquake. Remember Whiscash from Pokemon? In Japanese mythology, Catfish are said to cause earthquakes, so it's a very cute tie-in with his design. This serves as a screen nuke that deals big damage to everything nearby, plus shoots sparks on the ground just in case something survives. The wind-up and cooldown are harsh, so it requires some skill to use well, but it's incredibly strong and fun when it does go off. Crush Crawfish's stage is the best in the game bar none. In short, both fun set pieces and theming. The shipyard begins on a series of girders and cranes, but ends in a really neat area, where X tips over a ship and has to scale it vertically. It's neat and doesn't drag on too long, and also doesn't end up being overly gimmicky. If anything, it's a bit too easy as I cleared it without any trouble, but the spectacle is nice. Crush Crawfish is a pretty simple boss. He tosses out his claws and tries to grab X. His grabs are easy to dodge, but deal huge damage when he does land them. To aid in this, he also tosses out smaller projectiles that prevent X from jumping. He's dangerous when not dodged well, but pretty easy with skill. The Triad Thunder isn't a full-blown shutdown either, but it does help a lot. Crush Crawfish's weapon, the spinning blade, is easily the best weapon in the game for regular use. It shoots two blades forward that then spin out and backwards behind X. At close range, both blades hit simultaneously for huge damage that shreds almost any enemy in the game, primarily because it gets past the post-hit invincibility that enemies have, besides it being able to hit far above and below X. When charged, the blade hangs in front of X, a medium distance away, which does shred things, but a bit less efficiently and at a much higher weapon energy cost. After the 5th Maverick, Bit's counterpart Byte appears. Byte is far easier than Bit's. He tosses a magnet that makes it hard for Mega Man to wall jump, can only get one in, then charges. Wall jump when he starts running, air dash over him. Why isn't he the first instead of Bit? He's so much easier! Bit's a chaotic nightmare, what were they thinking? Defeating him with the Tornado Fang prevents him from reappearing later. Neon Tiger stage has a cool design with the jungle thing clutter going on, but doesn't offer a lot in gameplay, a bit too long with very little variety, lots of halls and enemies. There's a very easy shortcut in the first section. The dragonfly enemies can be stood on and can be used to skip a good chunk of the first area, but it's still pretty long despite that. The mid-boss just dies to Triad Thunder with no effort. It's a centipede that crawls around the walls and floor, but just repeatedly tossing out Triad Thunder just causes it to die while it's still underground. Neon Tiger is hard if fought legit, borderline impossible as a first choice for someone not incredibly experienced. He's fast and likes to bounce around a lot, while shooting out beams, diving, and charging X, and blocking all charge shots, requiring X to use the uncharged buster against him. That said, the spinning blade makes him free, forcing him into a loop where he'll keep jumping between walls to be annihilated without any real effort or risk. Too hard or too easy, no in between in X3. His weapon, the Ray Splasher, is not awful, shooting beams in a spread pattern for a few seconds at decent range, not always useful, not always particularly interesting. The charge version summons an orb that shoots beams out randomly in like 16 different directions. It could hypothetically work out, but it probably won't. Gravity Beetle's stage is dull if pretty. Like a lot of stages here, it's long hallways and enemies, but the sunsets and the windows are pretty. Gravity Beetle himself is funny. He's apparently not a Maverick, but avenging his brother Boomer Quanger, a boss from Mega Man X1. Gravity Beetle is a cakewalk. He jumps around slowly tossing out black holes. They hurt pretty bad, so with the buster it could be kinda tough, but the Ray Splasher destroys him. The gravity well is broken in a lot of scenarios, although only the next boss is affected by it at all. All other bosses are immune to it for reasons that will be very obvious. Its uncharged shot is a screen nuke that damages all enemies on screen a middling amount, while its charged shot reverses gravity for all enemies except X, pinning them to the ceiling. It's basically useless outside of a few very small scenarios and being used to get the armor parts. A quick aside for Vile's stage, this isn't mandatory, but it can be accessed anytime between the 2nd and 8th bosses, meaning right before 8 is the best time to do it when Mega Man has the most upgrades. It can be accessed from Crush Crawfish, Full Catfish, and Blizzard Buffalo stages, and features a short stage in the fight against Vile Mark II, a returning villain from the first X game who was killed and revived by Doppler, but refuses to follow orders and just wants revenge. He initially appears in his ride armor, dashing back and forth and attacking, then once that's destroyed he hops around fairly quickly shooting various projectiles. He's fairly tough early on, but upgrades make him easy to tank and kill, and the spinning blade weakness obviously shreds him. If defeated without his weakness or not fought at all, as this is entirely optional, he'll reappear at the end of the game. If he is killed, something else will take his place. It's a neat reward for going out of the way to fight him because he is relatively tough, and I appreciate another option to add replay value. After his defeat, the stage is set to self-destruct and Mega Man needs to quickly leave. It's a unique challenge and fits well with the stage's simple layout. Last Hornet stage is largely nothing special, a lot of enemy corridors as typical, with a more open warehouse segment after. The Shuriken mini-boss isn't that much of a threat, he's barely capable of hitting you if you just keep wall jumping, but I do find its design funny, a holographic wireframe that probably looked impressive at the time for being semi-3D, but looks pretty silly today. You have to remember it was the 90s, the Lawnmower Man was popular. This is also the stage where the ride armor is unlocked, allowing the use of all 4 ride armors, not that it features prominently in this stage. Its segment is probably the shortest. I'll quickly cover the ride armors here too. The standard ride armor is the most basic, it can punch and dash. The Kangaroo is the same, but with extendable arms on a charged attack. The Hawk armor can briefly fly to get extra height and shoots missiles. It's definitely the best of the 4, but is never necessary for anything. And the Frog armor always hops while moving, jumps the highest, and also shoots homing missiles, plus can be used underwater. Segments where they can be used are always incredibly short and exist mostly to hide items rather than do anything interesting. Blast Hornet might be hard on paper, he zips around in the air, diving at X and tossing bees at him. I'm sure Buster only, he's incredibly difficult, but the gravity well makes him hilarious. No need to aim, just mash and walk back and forth until he dies. He has no recourse for a screen nuke weakness. His weapon is fun though, the parasitic bomb clings to enemies and carries them into each other to destroy both, which is unsurprisingly very useful, although against bosses it just deals damage. And its charged form puts out targeting reticles and launches bees at nearby enemies for as long as the button is held, which is pretty good. I mean, you don't have to put yourself in the line of fire to hit things, but it does only trigger at a relatively close distance. And with that, all 8 Maverick stages are cleared, and the final set of stages, Dr. Doppler's laboratory, opens up. Each of the stages in the laboratory is designed to be a final test for everything the players learned, a tried and true system that Mega Man has always relied on. Doppler's first stage is very platforming heavy, featuring 2 tough segments in a row, air dashing under long spikes, then wall jumping along walls that close in very quickly. Full segments had me a bit stumped for a while, kind of embarrassingly long on the wall jump because I kept overthinking it and overcomplicating it. The poor mid-boss of the stage is weak to the spinning blade, which makes him entirely free. After the mid-boss, X can get the ultimate armor, which has the power of all 4 chips, making the rest of the game a lot easier. Double air dash, huge damage resistance, free healing, and sub-tank refills, plus the hyper cannon. The boss of the stage depends on whether both Bit and Byte were killed. If they were, the boss is Press Disposer, a mostly passive boss that tries to grab Mega Man for huge damage while summoning minions to harass him. Breaking his nose also floods the floor with acid, forcing Mega Man to stay wall jumping the entire time. The Tornado Fang's range is good for breaking it from the walls, but the ultimate armor makes this and basically everything else before the final boss pretty trivial because of the 4 always full sub-tanks. If either Bit or Byte survives, there's a different boss, the fusion of the 2, God Car Machine Oaneri. As Bit and Byte alone do, he hits hard, either shooting out huge slashes that deal good damage and are hard to dodge, or grabbing Mega Man for massive damage. The ultimate armor makes him a breeze, as does the massive damage the Ray Splasher does if you don't care about eating damage while doing it, as the ultimate armor allows. Doppler's second stage only has one noteworthy section, a long vertical shaft with spikes on both sides that requires riding on enemies to get to the top of. If Vile is defeated, a number of changes take place, namely the stage won't be destroyed and stronger enemies will be placed around. It's a nice way to show who Vile is silently. If he's alive, he's destroyed the building, wiped out the powerful enemies, mid-boss and boss, and it builds him up to be rash, violent, and intimidating. Assuming Vile is gone, the mid-boss is the only boss besides the intro boss that can be fought as Zero. Beating him as Zero injures him, guaranteeing the bad ending, but also giving X the Z-Saber, which gives him a 6th level of charge, which hits incredibly hard and shoots a massive beam across the screen, on top of the slash, which itself shreds most things. The mid-boss itself is nothing special. X can destroy it in seconds with the spinning blades, while Zero needs to be a bit more careful to dodge its powerful grabs, but can do so simply by dashing around until it lands and leaves itself open. Vile's death also hits him with Volt Kurigeli, a giant jellyfish that floats in water and attacks by throwing out projectiles. It's weak to Triad Thunder and is completely shut down by it. If Vile hasn't been killed, he appears here instead with a slightly stronger ride armor, but otherwise unchanged. The third stage is the Series Tradition Boss Rush. Get dropped into a room with teleporters, fight all the bosses, the end. It's really fun to see how much more powerful you become, but it's honestly trivialized by the ultimate armor's health restoration, besides the fact that the center of the room has like a power-up generator that you can attack up to like 5 or 6 times to fully heal yourself between, but it all feels kind of pointless. After all 8 Mavericks are knocked down again, X fights the man behind it all, Doppler. For being the big bad, Doppler's kinda easy, not helped by the 4 full sub-tanks. He dashes back and forth, lobs electric burst with a shield up that can only be broken with acid burst, and if Mega Man tries to attack, he'll put up an energy shield that absorbs projectiles, so counterattacking him is the best way to get hits in. Outside of the absorption, he's pretty weak and easy to solve, a bit disappointing for a final boss. But of course, no X game would be complete without the reveal that Sigma was behind it all. It wasn't as cliche at the time of X3's release, he was dead in the end of X2, but Sigma coming back and being behind everything would go on to be used over and over and over and over. Not X3's fault, they hide the twist okay, Sigma's brought up a couple times, but not that often. But the X series is kinda cursed with this twist being repeatedly shoved in it. It's stupider in retrospect than it was at the time. And even fully kitted out with ultimate armor, it's a pretty hard fight. Then again, either one of its forms alone wouldn't be too difficult. Sigma's first phase can be a real health trainer, and is easily the hardest to learn. Rapid fire fireballs, quick movements, and shield tosses that cover most of the screen. Learning him would easily shred 2 sub-tanks I couldn't afford to lose, which would cause me to lose in the second phase. Although I do find that wall jumping above him and switching sides with double air dashes while dropping spinning blades on him minimize damage in this phase. His second phase, Kaiser Sigma, is easy once you get it, but difficult to learn. Kaiser Sigma is giant and only vulnerable on his head. All the while, he fires mines and extremely damaging missiles constantly, occasionally switching sides of the room, while also only being vulnerable to charge buster shots. It's easy to take a lot of damage in the clutter while trying to aim, but it's perfectly manageable by learning. Switch sides to get space, avoid missiles at all costs, even if you need to bump Sigma for lesser damage, and 2 wall jumps and a very brief pause will almost always get a solid headshot. With this and some spare sub-tanks in case, it's perfectly doable. It's also noteworthy that Kaiser Sigma takes more than half his health bar if hit with the Z-Saber's slash. It's a bit hard to land because it requires getting in very close, but it's definitely worthwhile for how easy it makes him if you don't care about getting the bad ending. Finally, upon his defeat, Sigma loses his body and becomes Sigma Virus. Like the Shuriken boss, it's a crummy looking wireframe, but I suppose it is what it is. Sigma Virus isn't so much a fight as it is a brief platforming segment. Wall jump away from rising lava, or if you don't feel like it and have a decent amount of health, just ride it to the top. There, either Zero if he's not injured, or Doppler if he is, will finish off Sigma for good using an antivirus Doppler made off screen, I guess. I don't know. It is worth noting that while Doppler does sacrifice himself in the bad ending, either way Doppler is never seen again in the series, so presumably he just dies either way. I don't know. The actual ending is a bit melodramatic and also a lie, with X wondering why he fights, a recurring if poorly fleshed out theme in the X series that only gets worse as it goes along, as well as promising that someday X will need to destroy Zero, something that blatantly never happens in the series. It's a fine ending, although like the Sigma twist, it fails in retrospect because Sigma is obviously going to be back and Zero is mostly fine as he is. They do have like a fight in X5, but maybe that's what this was referring to, I don't know. Mega Man X3 has a manga adaptation, it's fine. The art is okay, but extremely 90s, and there's some very strange shit in it, like Mega Man's pirate girlfriend, which I assume is a holdover from the X1 or X2 adaptation. X is well characterized, he's very against fighting and killing unless necessary, and even spares most of the Mavericks, reforming them into allies, which comes back in a cute way in the end, although it is a very anime moment to have the power of friendship save him. The fights are pretty decent. The worst thing about it is how anime it gets, really. It's very tropey, from X getting killed and revived in a supersuit to long-winded monologues. It all feels pretty generic most of the time. I don't have a lot to say about it, honestly. It's very short, decently generic. It's hardly worth reading, in my opinion, especially because structuring it around the game's format of having to go fight all 8 bosses and go fight Sigma again. Like, this is the 3rd time in the manga that he's fought Sigma. It kind of makes it just like this awkward, melodramatic battle manga that's too short to fill in too many details about. Mega Man X3 is difficult to sum up because it's almost good. It looks and plays well because it's a Mega Man X game. The issues it has are numerous and slight, but add up. Bosses that hit way too hard for seemingly no reason, and then become incredibly easy with the weapons they're weak to. Long levels that drag, Tunnel Rhino and Blizzard Buffalo being nearly identical, the random hell of Bit and Byte appearing, and just completely fucking you over on stage 3 for hours. My second playthrough on the PS1 version, where I was warmed up, prepared, and knew what I was getting into, was much more pleasant. Still not great, but enjoyable. The game loves to put up hard walls and stand firm with them, and a lot of these walls feel more annoying than interesting, like a stage 3 Bit, who easily surpasses everything except Sigma in difficulty. There's some cool ideas here and there, the secret vial stage for some alternate bosses and increased replay value, some neat if useless weapon gimmicks like the gravity well, and outside of a few who are just obnoxious, I think the bosses are well designed and interesting. Stand around and fight Neon Tiger for a bit without using the double blade on him. He's fast, he's always moving, blocks charge shots, it's neat. It's a game that's less than some of its parts, good core gameplay shoved into a rush, shoddy, cruel game that overstays its welcome to an extent. It's on the lower end of the X spectrum, saved from getting more criticism, I think, by being far less bad than some of the bigger mistakes in the series, notably X6 and X7. Not terrible, but definitely the awkward third child of the Super Nintendo trilogy. Largely I don't recommend it, especially as like a first Mega Man X game, like not even, no, absolutely not, but people who are really into Mega Man X may have fun getting beaten down by it, although I'm sure they would have played it at this point.